In a world where evil specters invade the mortal realm via the internet, a father must protect his daughter from his ex-wife's vengeful spirit. In an apartment, a man seals the cuff of his pants with red tape and covers his entire body with a makeshift shroud of red-colored fabric. Then, he applies drops of a similar color onto both eyes before donning dark sunglasses. When the man leaves the apartment, he sees a woman sobbing outside another unit who begs him for help because she doesn't know what happened to her sister. However, he ignores her and heads out of the building. In the alley, he sees a man whose bottom half appears to have disintegrated into a black mold-like substance. Seconds later, he sees a ringing phone on the ground, so he destroys it with his boot. Then, as he passes a corner, he watches a ghost consuming a woman's soul through her mouth. When the spirit sees the man, it moves before him but eventually disappears. Meanwhile, Michelle sits in front of her computer while ash swirls around the apartment. In the living room, she sees an emergency broadcast on the TV instructing all civilians to contact local authorities for directions to regional safe zones. Panicked, the woman searches for her daughter Justine. But when she checks the child's room, all she finds is a pair of scissors on the ash-covered floor. Michelle knocks on her neighbor's door, but all she hears from the other side is someone unfurling tape. She goes to the hospital but sees the overwhelmed staff dealing with patients exhibiting the same symptom: black mold-like growth on their limbs. Meanwhile, the woman's ex-husband, Stephen, barges into the apartment and sees that everything's coated in ash. That night, Michelle witnesses a man hang himself from the side of a building and spots the familiar black substance on his hand. Minutes later, she encounters a dazed woman in the middle of the street. She begs her for help but realizes the lady's speaking to someone on her Bluetooth earpiece. After the distraught mother walks away, the infected woman steps in front of an oncoming vehicle, ending her life. Soon, Michelle arrives at her aunt and uncle's house, and to her surprise, finds Aunt Carmen sitting on the porch. She asks the older woman if Justine's with her, but the aunt says no. Michelle explains that there's a horrible illness spreading around that compels the infected to take their own lives. She wonders if she could speak to her Uncle Pete, so Carmen says her husband's in the back room, but she isn't sure if he wants to talk to anyone right now. They hear loud banging as they approach the door, so the older woman says their pet cat, Mr. Peppers, is in there with him. When Michelle moves to turn the knob, Carmen fearfully tells her to stop because she doesn't think the man inside is her husband anymore. Suddenly, the mother hears the swing creaking outside and goes to check. Meanwhile, Stephen picks up the scissors from his daughter's bedroom floor and wonders what happened. Concurrently, the woman sees a child wearing a hoodie on the swing outside the house. Convinced it's her daughter, Michelle assures the child that everything is gonna be okay. However, Carmen says the child's been watching her all day and warns the woman that she might get infected if she touches her. When the mother's about to lay her hand on the kid, the child quickly sprints away. She chases the figure into the woods but then has a vision of her hugging Justine and using the scissors to take her daughter's life. In the apartment, Stephen checks his ex-wife's computer and finds her journal. She detailed how their strained marriage took a toll on Justine's performance in school, how she suspected the man of having an affair, and how she believed he now lived in a cabin with a mistress. Then, she wrote about their divorce and how she tried online dating after it was finalized. Michelle revealed that she found a strange website where people took their own lives in front of their webcams. She admitted that it scared her at first, but took comfort in the stranger's shared loneliness that only they could understand. Eventually, when Stephen won full custody, she wrote that she'd rather take both her and her daughter's lives because she couldn't bear the thought of Justine living with her ex-husband and his mistress, Marta. Minutes later, the man walks back to his parked car and cries in the driver's seat. The next day, Michelle sweeps up the ash in the child's room, and when she picks up the scissors, she recalls kneeling on the floor and asking the crying daughter to come closer. Eventually, the woman finishes tidying up the apartment and contentedly stands in the middle of the dining room. Meanwhile, Stephen wakes up in his vehicle and sees Justine wandering along the middle of the street. Concurrently, Michelle hears the man's voice and sees her daughter from the balcony. As she excitedly runs out, she leaves a messy apartment behind, implying that the clean state it was in was all in the woman's head. Outside, Stephen hugs his daughter, relieved that she is alive. He asks the child if her mother got sick, and Justine nods. As the father and daughter drive away, Michelle calls out to them but to no avail. Suddenly, she transforms into a specter, revealing that she has been a ghost this whole time. On their way out of the city, Stephen sees an infected man about to jump off an overpass, so he instructs the child to close her eyes while he accelerates to make sure the jumper doesn't land on their car. Before reaching the cabin in the mountains, they encounter a roadblock where Hutch explains that they had to put it up to make sure only residents and their families pass through. Then, the armed man asks the pair to step out of the vehicle to check if they aren't infected. When Justine lifts her sleeve, black markings on her shoulder alarm the men, so the father wipes it off to show that it's just dirt. That night, Stephen asks his daughter what happened to her mother. The child recounts Michelle saying she wanted to die and how she had the black markings on her arms. She says the mother sang a lullaby as she held the crying child. However, when Michelle was about to end Justine's life with the scissors, the woman crumbled into a pile of ashes. Then, the daughter says she went to Uncle Pete's house but he wouldn't come out of his room, so she stayed on the swing until her mother came. Confused, Stephen doesn't understand how she was able to see Michelle. Meanwhile, the ex-wife sees their digital family picture and proceeds to trash the apartment. In the cabin, someone knocks on the door as the father tucks his daughter to bed. Stephen answers the door and lets his furious girlfriend Marta inside. She admonishes the man for leaving her to fend for herself in the city for 3 days, so he explains that he was looking for his daughter. Concurrently, Carmen sits by the bedroom door while her husband Pete says she can't fool him and eats their pet cat's innards for sustenance. On the floor lies a pamphlet explaining that the color red keeps the evil spirits away, prompting Pete to cover his body with the animal's blood. However, he realizes he needs to leave the room for his maintenance medication. But when he opens the door, the sight of Carmen's ghost causes him to have a heart attack. Then, the specter kneels by the man's body and feasts on his essence. In the apartment, Michelle types on the computer keyboard with a blank look on her face. In the cabin, Marta thinks the belief that red tape keeps the ghosts away is bogus, and that she'd rather not seal herself shut in her tomb. When she sees Stephen doing supply inventory, she thinks he'd rather it just be him and his daughter in the cabin so their rations last longer. The woman says she isn't completely useless to him because he can always sleep with her. When they're about to make love, they bump into the table, and the sound of the laptop turning on startles them. Marta doesn't know why he even has the gadget in the cabin, especially since she had 2 friends who ended their lives after touching their computers. Just as the woman's about to destroy the laptop with a golf club, Stephen stops her when he sees email notifications pop up on the screen. He realizes they're all from Michelle asking him for help. Suddenly, new emails appear, ordering the man to give their daughter back. Spooked, Marta swipes the computer off the table and it lands on the floor. Stephen asks the child if her mother was alive when she saw her at Aunt Carmen's house, but Justine insists she was dead. Hours later, the man picks the computer up off the floor and puts the screen back together. Then, he replies to the email, asking where Michelle is. Because of his response, the spirit manages to traverse the internet and find his exact location. To his horror, his ex-wife approaches him menacingly, but Justine's voice distracts the ghost. Before the spirit touches the child, Stephen grabs his daughter and runs out of the cabin. The scared mistress apologizes to the specter and says it was the man who initiated the affair. Stephen tries to save his girlfriend, but Michelle consumes her soul. To escape the vengeful spirit, the man runs back to the vehicle and drives off with Justine. During the drive back to the city, the child asks if her mother's trying to kill them, so the father says she just misses them. Stephen stops the vehicle when a burning car blocks the road. Suddenly, the man in red breaks the passenger seat window and threatens to shoot the pair if they don't take him where he needs to go. Meanwhile, Hutch enters Stephen's cabin and sees the clothless Marta standing in front of a mirror. He stammers when the infected woman tells him to touch her. However, when Marta presses her body against his, Hutch gives in to temptation and makes love to her. During the deed, the woman's body disintegrates into a black mold-like substance, and the horrified man runs out of the cabin. Hours later, Hutch screams in fear as Marta's ghost catches up to him in the woods. Meanwhile, the man in red orders Stephen to head into a computer warehouse to steal a basic multi-use infrared microprocessor which he says he'll need to save the world. Inside the warehouse, the man wanders the maze-like aisles until he finds the microprocessors. While checking the items to make sure he grabs the correct one, an unfamiliar man's spirit reaches out to touch catch him while he's pinned down to the floor after the shelves collapse. Fortunately, he manages to evade the ghost and runs back outside to the vehicle. Later, Stephen mentions how he saw his ex-wife's specter last night, and he wants to know how she came back and if it's even her. So the man in red theorizes that it's a person's soul floating in an empty void after death, and then finding a way back to life. However, their method only allows them to exist as ghosts, and this realization hurts those who come back because they're still dead. Meanwhile, Michelle mutilates her body with a scissors, and the lack of pain and blood forces her to accept the reality of her death. Before going on his way, the man in red hands Stephen a roll of red tape and says it's the color frequency that the spirits can't penetrate. That afternoon, they stop at a gas station, but when the attendant doesn't respond, the father decides to enter through the back door of the kiosk. He finds the attendant slumped in a chair in front of the gas pump control board, so he slowly reaches over to activate his pump and says he'll leave the payment there. However, just as he's about to fill the tank, the attendant appears, startling Stephen. The father asks about any nearby refugee camps, so the man mentions one 5 hours away. The employee seems normal at first, but unbeknownst to the customer, the black markings spread down to his wrist. Suddenly, Stephen sees the attendant spraying gas over his body before lighting himself on fire with a lighter, so the man quickly drives away from the ghastly scene. Eventually, they run out of gas and park by the side of the road in the middle of nowhere. When Justine says she's too scared to go to sleep, the man comforts her and says it's just like when they used to go camping. After seeing the nearby cell towers, Stephen takes out the red tape and covers all the vehicle's windows. Justine recalls what Marta said about not wanting to seal herself in her tomb, so the father assures her that their staying inside the car isn't the same thing. Hours later, the child hears her mother's voice calling for her outside. She wakes Stephen, but the weary man tells her it's just the wind and to go back to sleep. However, the curious daughter sneaks out of the vehicle and follows the voice. In the fog, she sees Michelle's silhouette and expresses how much she misses her mother. Moments later, Stephen wakes up and sees the open passenger door. Panicked, he searches for the child and grabs her just before his ex-wife touches the daughter. He carries the thrashing Justine back to the vehicle and tries to explain that the ghost isn't her mother. The upset daughter screams that she wants to see her mother and says she hates her father. In a moment of weakness, the man slaps his daughter to get her to stop screaming. Immediately remorseful of the deplorable act, he apologizes to Justine profusely and promises to never do it again. Then, the child says that she blames him for her mother's death because she wouldn't have been so sad had she gone with her. The next day, Stephen sees a bus headed to the refugee camp passing by, so he honks his horn to catch their attention. He instructs the child to run as fast as she can toward the bus as soon as she leaves the vehicle. However, Justine stops when she sees her mother reaching out to her. The father reiterates that the woman's dead and there's nothing they can do about it. The man carries his daughter, but Michelle appears between them and the bus. So Stephen tells Justine that he'll make things right and instructs her to run toward the bus and never look back. However, instead of following the child, the man stays behind and walks toward Michelle. When the daughter tries to run back to her father, a passenger grabs her to make sure she's safe. Meanwhile, the man tells the ghost that he knows she'll never stop looking for them, then suggests that she take him instead if all she needs is someone to share the loneliness with. Stephen braces himself as the spirit kisses him, but to his surprise, he is completely fine after she touches him. Before she disappears, the man thanks his ex-wife for her compassion and for letting him live. Suddenly, Marta's specter jumps on the man and consumes his soul. As the girlfriend's ghost walks away, she gives the smiling Michelle a knowing look, implying that both spirits wanted Stephen to suffer. Meanwhile, the woman sitting next to Justine comforts the child and assures the pain of losing her loved ones eventually goes away.
Subscribe to watch more videos like this, turn on notifications and leave a like to help the channel out. Thank you for watching.